The Haunting of Deadwater Lake. Inspired by true events, Deadwater Lake, a secluded body of water nestled deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, had long been the subject of whispered tales in the nearby town of Pine Hollow. Locals spoke of strange lights hovering over the water, sudden disappearances, and an eerie, bone-chilling silence that would sometimes blanket the area. Most dismissed these as folklore, stories passed down to keep children away from the lake's treacherous depths. But for the few who had dared to fish its waters, the stories became all too real. Ethan Rowe had heard the tales growing up. A lifelong outdoorsman, he wasn't one to scare easily. At 32, he had spent countless weekends fishing across the region, always in search of the perfect catch. When his friend Jake mentioned Deadwater Lake during a late-night poker game, Ethan's curiosity piqued. "You're telling me there's bass in that lake the size of my leg?" Ethan asked, his skepticism evident in his tone. Jake leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I'm telling you, man, no one's been able to fish there in years. People go out and things happen. Boats capsize, gear gets destroyed, and some folks just don't come back." Ethan smirked. "Sounds like an excuse for bad fishermen. You're telling me you're scared of a lake?" Jake hesitated, glancing at the others in the room before answering. "I'm telling you it's not just a lake. There's something wrong with that place. The water doesn't feel natural. And those stories, they've been around for a reason." Ethan waved off the warning, already imagining the challenge. By the end of the night, he'd decided he was going to Deadwater Lake. Superstitions be damned. The following Saturday, Ethan loaded his truck with his usual fishing gear. A sturdy rod, a tackle box filled with lures, and a small aluminum boat strapped to the roof. The drive to Deadwater Lake took him through dense forests, the kind where cell service disappeared and the only sounds were the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional bird call. By the time he arrived, the sun was high, casting a golden glow over the lake's surface. From a distance, the water looked pristine, surrounded by towering pines and a rocky shoreline. But as Ethan stepped closer, he noticed something unsettling. The air felt heavier here, almost oppressive, and the lake was unnaturally still. No ripples, no breeze, no birds skimming the surface, just an eerie, mirror-like calm. Ethan shook off the unease and launched his boat. As he paddled out, the silence deepened. Even the sound of his oars slicing through the water seemed muffled. Hours passed, and Ethan's initial excitement turned into frustration. Not a single bite. He tried every lure in his box, even the ones he'd sworn off years ago. Still nothing. It was as if the lake was devoid of life. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan decided to try one last spot. A shadowy cove tucked away on the far side of the lake. The moment he entered the cove, the temperature dropped noticeably. The water here was darker, almost black, and a faint mist clung to the surface. Ethan cast his line, watching it disappear into the inky depths. Minutes passed, and just as he was about to reel it in, the line went taut. Adrenaline surged through him as he fought to reel in his catch. Whatever was on the other end was strong, pulling with a force unlike anything he'd encountered before. Sweat dripped down his face as he struggled to keep control of the rod. And then the line snapped. Cursing under his breath, Ethan examined the frayed end of his line. It wasn't a clean break. It looked as though it had been cut. A sudden splash nearby made him whip his head around. In the fading light, he saw something or someone emerge from the water. It was a figure tall and gaunt, with pale, waterlogged skin that glistened unnaturally. Its hollow eyes locked onto Ethan, and a wide, unsettling grin spread across its face. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure began to move toward him, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it didn't belong in this world. Panicking, Ethan grabbed his paddle and began to row back to shore. But no matter how hard he rowed, the figure seemed to stay just beneath the surface, keeping pace with him. The boat suddenly lurched, as if something massive had struck it from below. Ethan nearly toppled overboard but managed to steady himself. He didn't dare look back, focusing only on the shore that seemed impossibly far away. By the time Ethan reached land, the sun had vanished completely, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to light his way. He stumbled out of the boat, collapsing onto the rocky shore. For a moment he thought he was safe. Then he heard it. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the water, followed by the sound of wet footsteps approaching. The haunting of Deadwater Lake. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. The laughter grew louder, an inhuman sound that seemed to echo from every direction. His eyes darted to the tree-line, searching for an escape. But the forest, once inviting, now looked like an impenetrable wall of darkness. Behind him, the wet footsteps drew closer, each one accompanied by the squelch of something heavy dragging across the rocky shore. Ethan forced himself to turn around, clutching the handle of his fishing knife. The figure from the water was now fully on land, its gaunt frame illuminated by the pale moonlight. Its skin hung loosely from its bones, mottled with algae and what looked like deep, black veins. Its mouth was unnaturally wide, stretching into a grin that exposed rows of jagged, yellow teeth. But it was the eyes, two hollow, black pits, that paralyzed Ethan with terror. "Why did you come here?" a voice rasped, though the figure's lips didn't move. The words seemed to vibrate in Ethan's skull, more thought than sound. Ethan stumbled backward, his knife trembling in his hand. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. Then, with a sudden, unnatural burst of speed, it lunged at him. Ethan barely managed to dodge, the creature's claws swiping through the air where his chest had been moments before. He sprinted toward the trees, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate bid for safety. Branches tore at his clothes and scratched his face, but he didn't stop. The forest was alive with sound now, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, and the guttural growls of the creature pursuing him. No matter how fast he ran, the footsteps stayed close behind, relentless and unyielding. Ethan's foot caught on a root, and he went sprawling to the ground. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and his knife flew from his hand, landing somewhere in the darkness. He scrambled to his knees, but before he could rise, a cold, slimy hand clamped around his ankle. A scream tore from his throat as he was yanked backward, dragged across the forest floor toward the lake. He clawed at the dirt and rocks, his nails breaking as he tried to find something, anything, to hold on to. "Please!" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "Let me go!" The creature didn't respond. Its grip was impossibly strong, its claws digging into his skin. Ethan twisted around, kicking at its hand with his free leg. To his surprise, his boot connected, and the creature hissed, momentarily releasing him. Ethan scrambled to his feet and ran again, this time toward a faint glow in the distance. He recognized it as his truck, parked at the edge of the forest. If he could just make it there, he might have a chance. The truck came into view, its headlights reflecting off the lake's surface. Ethan yanked the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut behind him. His hands fumbled with the keys, which he'd left in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt road that led away from the lake. In the rearview mirror, he saw the creature standing at the edge of the water, watching him. Its grin was still there, impossibly wide, but its eyes seemed to burn with anger. As the truck sped away, the air around him began to feel lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. But Ethan knew he wasn't safe. Not yet. The drive back to Pine Hollow was a blur. Ethan didn't stop until he reached the safety of his driveway, where he sat in the truck, trembling and covered in sweat. He couldn't shake the image of the creature from his mind. Those hollow eyes, that predatory grin. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. People needed to know the truth about Deadwater Lake. But when he tried to tell his story, no one believed him. The next day, Ethan returned to the lake with the sheriff and a small search party. They found his boat, overturned near the shore, but there was no sign of the creature. The cove where he'd cast his line was eerily still, the water dark and uninviting. "You probably just spooked yourself," the sheriff said, clapping him on the shoulder. "It happens to the best of us." Ethan didn't argue. He knew what he'd seen, and he knew he'd barely escaped with his life. But as the search party prepared to leave, Ethan noticed something. Near the edge of the cove, partially buried in the mud, was a fishing rod. Not his, but an older model, rusted and weathered by time. He bent down to pick it up, and as he did, he felt a chill run down his spine. Carved into the wooden handle was a name: William Hartwell. Ethan's blood ran cold. William Hartwell was one of the fishermen who had disappeared at Deadwater Lake decades ago. That night, Ethan packed his gear and left Pine Hollow for good. He never went back to Deadwater Lake, and he never set foot in a boat again. But sometimes, late at night, he would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the sound of wet footsteps and that terrible, guttural laughter. And deep in the Appalachian Mountains, Deadwater Lake remained as still and silent as ever, its dark waters hiding secrets that no one dared to uncover. The haunting of Deadwater Lake. After leaving Pine Hollow, Ethan couldn't escape the nightmares. No matter how far he traveled, how much he tried to convince himself it was over, the lake clung to him like a shadow. Each night, he dreamed of the creature, its hollow eyes staring into his soul, its grin promising that their connection was far from severed. Desperate for answers, Ethan began to research. He scoured local archives, read every piece of folklore about Deadwater Lake, and spoke to anyone who claimed to know its history. What he uncovered was a story older and darker than he could have imagined. The curse of Deadwater Lake. Long before Pine Hollow existed, the land was home to the Waya tribe, a small and deeply spiritual Native American community. The Waya revered the lake, believing it to be a gateway between the world of the living and the spirit realm. They called it Atsakaliwa, which roughly translated to the Mirror of Souls. According to legend, the lake was sacred but dangerous. The spirits of the restless dead were drawn to its waters, seeking passage to the afterlife. To maintain balance, the Waya performed regular rituals, offering prayers and sacrifices to keep the spirits at peace. But harmony shattered in the late 1700s, when European settlers arrived. They dismissed the tribe's warnings as superstition and began exploiting the lake for fishing and resources. Conflict erupted, and the settlers, armed and determined, drove the Waya from their ancestral land. As the tribe retreated, their shaman, a woman known only as Kalani, stood on the lake's shore and uttered a curse. It was said her voice carried on the wind, echoing through the mountains. "May this water become a prison for the wicked and a grave for the greedy. Those who disturb its depths will find only death and despair." Kalani vanished into the forest, never seen again. But from that day forward, strange occurrences began. The settlers who had laughed at the Waya's warnings started disappearing one by one. Boats capsized in calm waters, their occupants never resurfacing. Lights flickered over the lake at night, and eerie voices carried on the wind. The first sightings. Ethan's research uncovered old newspaper articles from the 1800s. Fishermen reported seeing ghostly figures walking across the water, their faces twisted in agony. One account, dated 1843, described a water demon dragging a man from his boat in broad daylight. The creature Ethan had encountered wasn't just a random monster. It was the embodiment of Kalani's curse. Over the centuries, the lake had become a feeding ground for vengeful spirits, and the demon was their guardian, ensuring no one escaped with what they had taken from the lake. But one detail stood out. The creature didn't appear randomly. Each sighting coincided with a disruption to the lake. Overfishing, pollution, or even attempts to build near its shores. Ethan realized his own actions, though innocent, had likely triggered its wrath. A forgotten journal. While digging through the Pine Hollow Historical Society's archives, Ethan stumbled upon a forgotten journal. It belonged to William Hartwell, the fisherman whose name had been carved into the rod Ethan found. The journal was dated 1952, the year Hartwell vanished, and its entries detailed his time fishing on Deadwater Lake. At first, the journal was mundane, notes about the weather, types of fish caught, and favorite lures. But as Ethan read further, the tone changed. July 14, 1952. The lake feels different today. Quiet. Too quiet. No fish biting, no birds in the sky. Even the air seems heavier. July 20th, 1952. I saw something in the water. Not a fish, not a log, something else. It was watching me. I know it sounds crazy, but I could feel its eyes on me. I don't think I'll come back here after today. The final entry sent chills down Ethan's spine. July 23rd, 1952. I tried to stay away, but I couldn't. Something's calling me back. I dream about the lake every night, about something rising from the water. It whispers to me, I don't want to go, but I have to. I don't think I'll come back this time. If anyone finds this journal, stay away from Deadwater Lake. It's not just a lake, it's alive. Ethan's plan. The journal confirmed what Ethan already suspected. The lake wasn't a natural body of water. It was a trap, a magnet for lost souls, feeding on anyone who disturbed it. But Ethan couldn't let it continue. Too many lives had already been lost, and he knew the only way to escape his nightmares was to confront the lake one final time. He needed to break the curse. Armed with everything he had learned, Ethan returned to Pine Hollow under the cover of night. He brought offerings, tobacco, cornmeal, and a handmade Wyatt talisman he'd found in a museum exhibit. His plan was simple but dangerous. Perform a cleansing ritual at the lake and hope it would appease the spirits. Standing on the shore, Ethan lit a small fire and placed the offerings in its center. He recited the Wyatt prayers he'd memorized, his voice trembling but steady. First, nothing happened. The lake remained still, the air heavy with anticipation. But then the water began to ripple. The creature emerged, rising from the depths like a shadow given form. It didn't attack this time. Instead, it stood at the water's edge, watching him with those hollow eyes. Ethan's voice wavered, but he kept going, finishing the prayer with a plea. Let the restless find peace. Let this place be free. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, the creature let out a deafening roar, its form dissolving into a cloud of mist that hung over the lake before vanishing completely. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time, the lake felt normal. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rippled the water's surface. Aftermath. Ethan never told anyone what truly happened that night, but the nightmares stopped. Deadwater Lake remained, but its eerie reputation began to fade. Fishermen returned, and the disappearances ceased. Yet, deep in his heart, Ethan knew the lake's peace might not last forever. Curses have a way of lingering, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And sometimes, late at night, Ethan would wake with a start, certain he'd heard the sound of wet footsteps echoing outside his window. The end. Story 2. The Whispering Marsh. Deep in the swamps of Louisiana lies Blackthorn Marsh, a vast, eerie wetland avoided by locals for generations. It's said the marsh has a voice, a whisper that calls to those who wander too close. Few who hear the whispers ever return. James Porter, an amateur wildlife photographer, dismissed the stories as nothing more than backwater superstition. Determined to capture the beauty of the swamp's untouched wilderness, he packed his camera gear and set off alone on a muggy summer morning. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of decaying vegetation clung to James as he paddled his canoe deeper into the swamp. Cypress trees loomed overhead, their gnarled roots rising like skeletal hands from the dark water. Dragonflies buzzed around him, and the occasional splash of a frog or snake broke the oppressive silence. James paused to photograph a particularly haunting scene. A cluster of trees draped in Spanish moss, their reflection rippling in the black water. As he adjusted his lens, he thought he heard something, a faint, melodic hum. He froze, listening. "Help me." The whisper was soft, almost swallowed by the buzzing of insects, but unmistakable. James looked around, his heart quickening. "Hello?" he called out. No response came, only the sound of the whisper again, this time closer. "Help, please." Convinced someone might be lost, James paddled toward the sound, his eyes scanning the swamp for any sign of movement. The whisper grew louder, guiding him deeper into the marsh. The trees thickened, their branches intertwining to block out the sunlight, and the water became darker, almost like ink. "Who's there?" James shouted, his voice shaky. A faint laughter echoed in response. Childlike, playful, yet deeply unsettling. James gripped his paddle tighter, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But before he could, his canoe struck something beneath the water and stopped dead. Looking down, James saw the decayed remains of a wooden post sticking out of the mud. Carved into it were strange symbols, worn and unreadable. Surrounding the post were other remnants: a submerged dock, the skeleton of an old cabin, and the rusted blade of a forgotten machete. James had stumbled upon the ruins of Blackthorn Settlement, a small village that had vanished without a trace over a century ago. The legend of Blackthorn. According to local lore, Blackthorn had been a thriving logging community in the 1800s. But when the swamp's waters began rising unexpectedly, strange things started happening. People reported hearing voices in the night, their names called by unseen entities. Children vanished from their beds, and search parties returned empty-handed, whispering of glowing figures deep in the marsh. Desperate to end the torment, the villagers turned to Marie Benoit, a Creole healer and alleged witch. Marie told them the swamp was cursed, a prison for the spirits of the restless dead. She offered to perform a ritual to cleanse the area, but the villagers accused her of being the cause of their misery. They dragged her to the water's edge and drowned her, ignoring her cries of innocence. As her body sank, she cursed them with her final breath. "May the swamp take you all." By the next morning, Blackthorn was gone. The villagers, their homes, and even the paths leading to the settlement had vanished beneath the swamp. Only whispers remained, luring the curious to their doom. Back in the present, James's canoe rocked violently, snapping him out of his thoughts. The water around him began to bubble, and the air filled with the sound of whispers. Dozens of voices, overlapping and growing louder. "Leave, leave, leave." James grabbed the sides of his canoe, his knuckles white with fear. The whispers grew deafening, and the bubbling water began to swirl, forming a small vortex beneath his canoe. The once still swamp had come alive. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice breaking. His only answer was a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the trees. The canoe lurched violently, nearly tipping over. James reached for his paddle, but it slipped from his hands, disappearing into the dark water. The whispers became clearer, as if spoken directly into his ears. "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the water around the canoe erupted. Pale, skeletal hands shot up from the depths, grasping at the sides of the canoe. James screamed, kicking at the hands, but more appeared, their icy grip pulling him closer to the edge. James toppled into the water, the cold shocking the air from his lungs. He thrashed wildly, his legs tangling in unseen weeds that seemed to pull him deeper. Beneath the surface, he caught glimpses of pale faces, their hollow eyes staring at him, mouths silently screaming. Desperate, James managed to break free and clawed his way back to the canoe, clinging to its edge. As he hauled himself up, a figure rose from the water before him. It was a woman, her skin pale and bloated, her hair a tangle of weeds. Her eyes burned with an unnatural light, and her mouth twisted into a smile that chilled James to the bone. "Marie Benoit," James whispered, recognizing her from the descriptions in the legends. The ghostly woman raised a hand, and the whispers ceased. The swamp fell into an eerie silence. "You have disturbed my rest," she said, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. I didn't mean to," James stammered, trembling. "I was just taking pictures." Marie's expression darkened. "Pictures proof. You wish to expose what should remain hidden." She leaned closer, her face inches from his. "Do you know what happens to those who cannot let the past lie buried?" James shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "They join it," she whispered. As her words hung in the air, the swamp came alive again. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, and the hands emerged from the water, reaching for James. With a surge of adrenaline, he pushed off the canoe and swam desperately toward the nearest patch of solid ground. The hands clawed at him, tearing at his clothes and skin, but he didn't stop. He reached the bank, dragging himself onto the muddy shore. Gasping for breath, he turned back to the water. The canoe was gone, and so was Marie Benoit. The swamp was still once more, as if nothing had happened. By the next morning, Blackthorn was gone. The villagers, their homes, and even the paths leading to the settlement had vanished beneath the swamp. Only whispers remained, luring the curious to their doom. As the years passed, the swamp became known as Blackthorn Marsh, a place to be avoided at all costs. Locals spoke of strange noises on still nights, of voices carried on the wind, calling out to those foolish enough to venture too far into the mist. Some claimed they had seen glowing lights or heard the laughter of children long after the settlement had disappeared. Others spoke of a dark figure, Marie Benoit, standing at the water's edge, her eyes burning with vengeance. James stumbled back to his car and drove straight home, leaving his camera gear and canoe behind. He never returned to Blackthorn Marsh, but the experience stayed with him. He swore he could still hear whispers at night, calling his name. Months later, a park ranger found James's abandoned camera on the edge of the swamp. The photos inside showed haunting images. Shadowy figures among the trees, glowing eyes in the darkness, and, in one frame, the pale face of Marie Benoit staring directly at the lens. Blackthorn Marsh remains untouched, its dark waters hiding secrets that few dare to uncover. And those who hear the whispers rarely live to tell the tale.